Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years, pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. This week on the podcast is a chat with one of my faves, Anjali Rao. Anjali and I first chatted on the podcast on episode 90, talking about how we could shift teacher trainings in the yoga space, and now she is back talking about her new book, Yoga as Embodied Resistance, a feminist lens on caste, gender, and sacred resilience in yoga history. Talk about a topic I can honestly really get into. Anjali talks about so many things I think we need to highlight when we discuss social change and resistance movements. And one of my favorites is the idea of history often only highlighting the exceptional narratives. In social change circles, I've seen this happen a lot too. We talk about the amazing organizers and leaders of change movements, people whom you and I both look up to, but we don't talk about the people behind the scenes who are taking care of the perceived mundane things like permits and grant writing and getting the styrofoam cups for the shitty coffee and quietly supporting folks in their local community. For a long while, I've noticed that there are so many loving folks who feel lost when they try to figure out what they can do to help and support resistance and change movements. They think they need to be, well, exceptional. But Anjali highlights in our talk together and in her book how ordinary women can help shape extraordinary futures. And damn, do I love that message. Now, before we begin though, will you please like, subscribe, or follow the podcast from wherever you're listening? That tells the algorithm to show the podcast to other yoga pros. And that way we can all chat around the water cooler together. And I have a training coming up online on September 24th at 11 a.m. Central. I'm covering how to host lunch and learns in your local community for medical practitioners and larger corporations. If you're working as a yoga pro, I want you to know that having like a presentation that is already set up for lunch and learns becomes an excellent way for you to continue to connect and find new work. Whether you're a yoga therapist, yoga teacher looking for more private clients, or a yoga studio looking to be the place for medical professionals or corporations to find wellness solutions, this training is for you. Oh, and it's free for a little bit, because the gatekeeping in this industry is ridiculous. And I, for one, would rather see all of us win a little than have a few of us win a lot while everyone else struggles. So go to the link in the show notes and snag the free training while it's around. Okay, thank you. Love you. Bye. Let's get into our talk on embodied resistance with Anjali Rao. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Oh my God, okay, so I just have the biggest crush on my guest today. I love her so much. She is a two-time guest. Now, welcome back to the podcast, Anjali Rao. Anjali, tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here. I am Anjali Rao, as Rebecca said. What do I do? I always struggle with that question, Rebecca, honestly. But first and foremost, I am a yoga practitioner, yoga student, yoga educator, you can say, and currently the author of a new book, which is going to be out, which is what we're going to be talking about, Yoga as Embodied Resistance, which offers like a feminist lens on caste and gender and sacred resilience in yoga history. I'm also doing my PhD in California Institute of Integral Studies, first year student. And so I'm an Indian American immigrant. I'm a very curious questioner of many things. I'm a rebellious being who does not want to be boxed into a certain category of anything. So that's all that is who I am.
Oh, that's the best intro. I just love it. I'm so excited to talk to you about your book. That was what we were talking about before I hit record. Can you give me like a little bit of a, like, let's dip our toe into the book because I mean, feminist resistance, my friend. Really, what? Like, let's talk about that forever. Tell me
I
what
know,
you.
right? Uh, well, I think I like we were talking about, Rebecca, just before we began the podcast. I really wanted to offer a lens which has not been offered much, especially from a South Asian, from an Indian woman, in currently. And so my lens is something which will look at yoga from a critical lens, unraveling the threads of patriarchy, caste, which has run through the tapestry of yoga for centuries, but has really not been questioned and not really been interrogated. And within the long 2,500, arguably 3,000 years old yoga history, there have been movements of resistance within yoga
Yeah.
because of the socio-political context of the times. Yoga emerges from various periods where there have been pushbacks against uh, patriarchy, against caste, against religious fundamentalism, against colonialism, and it has shaped yoga, and yoga has shaped these movements, as well as who are the people who have written history have been typically people who have had power. People who record history are people who have had power. And who are the people who have had power are usually the men, cis men. So my work has
Yes.
been really to unravel and interrogate those recorders of history, because those recorders of history and what gets recorded often gets to be institutionalized truths. So I really wanted to inquire into understandings of these men who then are forming these institutions and systems that we consider as universal truths. So who has been sharing their understanding of cosmos and the uh, spiritual traditions and lineages? Who are the founders? Who do we think of as founders? Have been typically men, and those have been the ones that have been recorded for centuries, and those
Mhm.
are considered to be the gurus. And so my work is to really interrogate those kind of very foundational histories of yoga, as well caste and yoga, Hinduism, but and also um, I feel like a lot of these scholarship exists. I'm not the only one who has done scholarship into all of these, but it has been preserved in very sort of scholarly academic tomes, not really accessible to the everyday yoga practitioner. So, what I've really tried to do, and it's an attempt, it's an experiment really, to really bridge the divide between academia and practice. And
Yeah.
scholarship and practice, because that has not been really the case for me to really look into some of these journals and all of that. There's been a paywall. I've had to pay money to access those journals. So what about the everyday practitioner who cannot afford that? So how can I bridge that divide? That has always been my concern about even stepping into academia, as I am doing currently, is how do we democratize scholarship, right? So, but to go back to the book, that's what I'm really trying to do. I'm offering a lens which I think has not been offered as much in the world of yoga, in yoga land, and really interrogate, and not to confound and confuse people, but to really clarify it, and like I said, really expand our understandings of these what we consider as institutionalized truths.
I love this because I have seen, as a person who's practitioner first, and I think most of us who are in the industry are practitioners more than we are scholars, right?
Mhm.
But we are consuming content produced by scholars who are often scholars first
Mm-hmm.
and not practitioners first. Like, I think the order of it matters. And you're right, there needs to be a bridge. I think a lot of the work from a scholarly lens comes from, I feel like you'll enjoy this joke. I've been calling cis het white men DEI hires in the yoga space because they're like the least of us, right?
Yeah.
like,
They
a,
are the least of us in the studios and the practices. But if you look
yeah,
at who writes the books,
yes,
who writes the books and who have been writing books are
yes,
cis white men,
yes,
right? Who are the ones who are always quoted as experts, right?
yes,
They are the cis white men, right? Or even before the cis white men in the yoga world, it was the Brahmin men.
yes, yes,
So, and it still continues to do so. I was just looking at some conference, or I don't know, a summit or something like that, just recently on Instagram, and there was not, first of all, there was not one South Asian. There was maybe one South Asian name, and that South Asian name was a man, and the rest were all white scholars. This is a scholarly conference, right? They're all white scholars, and I'm not saying that scholarship or white scholarship should be negated or undermined because of that, but I'm saying we need to expand uh,
yeah,
more voices who are in scholarship, because the our lenses most likely will be different because of our lived
yeah,
experiences, right? And our standpoints will be different because of our lived experiences, our cultural experiences, and what we consider as important. We might highlight things differently, and so offer a different window into some of the same material. So
yeah.
that's really been and I think that will be probably the work that I will continue to do, to really find the liminal spaces between scholarship and practice, and make it more accessible. I feel quite passionate that that probably is my role right now, you know.
Yeah, I think how you said that really well, that it's not that we're asking for cishet white men to leave the table, but you need to make the table round and bigger so that everybody gets a
Exactly.
seat, you know? And that's
Exactly.
like an important conversation to have. And it's an important awareness for practitioners and people in the industry to see that you're purposely seeking out the opinions and scholarly ideas of as many different people as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so that's what the books is trying to do too. I have, you know, if you ask me who the book is for, it is for the everyday practitioner who's curious for sure.
Yeah,
And also who's able to, or wants to, or inspires and aspires to hold complexity, because history is complex. History is
yeah,
nuanced, and right now we are in a world which is extremely polarized, and it's polarized um of simplification, oversimplification, and overgeneralization of everything, right? So my hope is that this book will inspire people to look at the world in a more well, what do you say, an expansive way, and looking at the nuances of things, and holding the both and of things,
yeah,
and looking at different viewpoints, like, okay, this is particularly looked at from this group in this way, but on the other hand, this group's looked at the same thing in another way, so I
yep,
think we need to have those conversations, and they're challenging conversations. It's not an easy conversation. For example, I am a person with caste privilege, and I'm talking about how caste privileged people are oppressors. So, and we are oppressors as well as we are oppressed, because right now I'm living in the United States of America, so I'm
yeah,
racialized, and there's patriarchy here, there's patriarchy there. But
yeah,
so those are the things that we really have to interrogate within ourselves. And I think, in the yoga world, we all know that the change begins within. So we have to kind of unravel and unlearn those things that we consider as truths, those unshakable, immutable truths, right? And so we have to kind of look at that, and then see, okay, where else am I holding oversimplified narratives? And what can I do to disrupt those narratives?
yeah,
How can I change the conversation that I'm having in my family? How can I change the conversation that I'm having in my neighborhood, or in my community that I have any agency in, right? That I have any influence in. So those, I really think that is the work that is cut out for all of us right now in the world,
Yeah.
who, who have platforms, or who have any sort of agency in any other groups.
Let's talk about that idea of oversimplification because you've brought this up, and I actually see that to be a huge problem within our industry. And like just in general in the West, I will say, because this is where I live and hang out with people, is that we tend to love to simplify something. Like an example I always used to say is like the checkbox example, like, you know, how you're going to be a good person, like, check, I've done this thing, and I've done this thing, and I've done this thing. Um, how do you see us shifting that? And what narratives do you see that we're obviously oversimplifying that you just want to say, yeah, let's rediscuss, you know, whatever you think we're really simplifying.
History,
Oh, yes.
right?
Good one.
um, History itself is being oversimplified, and
Yeah.
what is happening is, and one of the reasons why I chose history as a sort of a topic, because you can look at anything and study it deeply, and look at the nuances of everything, and everything is, in my world, in my point of view, complex, right?
Yeah.
So why I chose to study history, and offer sort of a feminist lens to history, is uh, because of how it is presented. Now, in the context of yoga, yoga history is probably given, if it is a very good teacher training, it's probably given maybe 3 hours or 2 hours. That's it. Or
Yeah.
maybe, that's it, with very little nuance and understanding. They're like, okay, this is what happened. This is the Vedic period. This is the Upanishadic blah, blah, blah. And then that's it.
Yeah.
Uh, and that is a good yoga teacher training. Many yoga
Yeah.
teacher trainings,
Vivekananda came and we're
yeah,
done. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So there is very little nuance, and there's very little understanding of, example, how caste was an integral part of the foundations of yoga. Even you can say, how gender plays a role, how heteropatriarchy is almost like the invisible, uh, you can say,
Yes.
life breath, in many
Yes.
of the teachings and the texts. So uh, what was the context of those times? And yes, maybe they've been mentioned, but they've been mentioned as footnotes. But
Yeah.
who has it impacted? It has impacted millions for centuries, because these become the absolute truths for people. They're like, this is my dharma, people say, but then who created those concepts, and what was it meant to do?
Yeah.
Right? So those are the things that, and how has that shape shifted, and what did it serve? What were these concepts serving? Who were the concepts serving? Right? Principles serving? And who are these people now, and what are those concepts serving now? Because at the end of the day, yes, yoga is about liberation, but liberation is not possible if we don't talk about oppression.
Yes. Right? Like it's only seeing the nice and not talking about what the devil you're liberating yourself from if you don't talk about the oppression.
Exactly. So, and oppression is many things, and it's caused by many factors, and interlinked factors. And what are some of the texts that are holding a certain social order in place? And what does that mean to hold that certain social order
Yeah.
in place? Because when you hold something a social order, it means that there are people who are going to be impacted, who don't have agency. So all those things that we don't really talk about, or don't really address, is not addressed. And the history books that I read from a yoga perspective did not really address those. The social histories of, for example, India and South Asia, some of the things that I read enlightened me to the things that were not mentioned in the yoga history books, right? So my work was then to really create these linkages between the social histories of South Asia, of especially India, because that's where I'm from, and and then link it to what was happening in the yoga world, yoga scene that time. So
Yeah.
really creating those links, and I really think it's an experiment. the book itself is an experiment. I don't know whether it'll I really honestly don't know whether it'll land. And I've tried to not simplify it. I've tried to not simplify it, and at the same time it's not hopefully a academic tome where people are like overwhelmed by it. So I've tried
Yeah.
to really simplify it to the best of my understanding and my capacity. um, and I started writing the proposal at the same time that I got admission into a PhD program. And my PhD program was about, is focusing at the intersections of feminism, social justice, and spirituality and religion, right? So it's a wonderful program, and I was really tempted to choose one rather than
Yeah.
do both, because both are humongous and humongous sort of um, what do you say, things to do. So
Yeah.
uh,
Undertakings. Yeah.
and yeah, undertakings, thank you. So I was just really wondering what to do, and I told my academic advisor. It almost happened the same day, almost, like within a 2 days. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, now what do I do? So I talked to my academic advisor, who's also a South Asian, and Dr. Alka Arora. I have to mention her, and she is my professor in California Institute of Integral Studies. And so I was like, this is what has happened. And so she's like, why don't you take 6 months, like the semester of, like, make it an independent study. And I was already writing, and so she's like, she can be the advisor. And I wrote my research, but she really helped to kind of um, give me critical feedback and insight. So it has shaped it. It's not my dissertation, I think. I definitely not a dissertation, but it has been shaped by some of the studies and some of the lenses that I've got because of my PhD program as well,
Yeah.
and input from my professor. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk because I want to talk about resistance. I want to talk about feminist resistance in the yoga space
Yeah.
because I think that in our current modern iteration of how we perceive yoga, we perceive everybody to be super neutral and very bland, and that's not the case. So tell us.
Yeah. No, thank you for bringing that up. So feminist resistance has always been a part of all histories, right?
Yeah.
Because patriarchy is prevalent all over the world,
Yeah, and
right?
it's bullshit.
Right? There is no part of the world that doesn't have patriarchy. Excuse me. Excuse me. That has that is devoid of patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
Um, so the book, I have four stories in the book. It leads with a sort of a account of a story based from each period in yoga history about a feminist resistance and movement, and then I kind of use that to lead into discussions of various things, from religious fundamentalism to colonialism to casteism to agency of a body,
Yeah.
of a person's body, and sexuality. So all those things I've kind of like talked about in the book, and there are so many ways in which there have been resistance movements within the long 500 to 3000 years of yoga history. And I think we need to be aware, or rather beware, that we're not talking about these big things like, you know everybody says, as soon as you say feminist resistance in yoga history, you bring up like these exceptional women, in the
Yeah.
way in the Vedic period. They were like,
Yes.
oh, there were 327 rishikas, and there were 3000, all the things.
Yeah.
So we really have to be very cautious about using what we call, what scholars call as exceptional histories, and say, oh, but everything was
Yes.
fine because there were 27 rishikas in the Vedic. So we really have to be, um, uh, what do you say, not only cautious but really complicate it,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
for and not oversimplify it.
Yeah.
So that's what I've tried to do here. And like I was mentioning to you before, we are at a time when women's rights to choose, women's rights to just be whoever they are, trans women, cis women, non-binary folks, all of us who are from any sort of marginalized backgrounds are feeling very much under attack all over the world because of authoritarian regimes. And authoritarian regimes typically come from highly patriarchal
Yes.
leadership, right? And paternalistic leadership. So my work, I hope, will inspire and ignite thought about, hey, there has been feminist resistance through these different means and methods and approaches, because it's not just one. There are many ways of resisting.
Yeah.
So I hope it will inspire and ignite, saying through periods of yoga history itself there have been threads of feminist resistance. So can we get inspired and informed and hold ourselves accountable to what's happening in the world. Yoga as this, this sort of a peaceful, sort of zen sort of a thing, is
Yeah.
is is a trope that feeds into holding the status quo, right?
Yes.
And while yoga hopefully should and can and has the potential for us to feel a certain sense of centeredness and quote unquote calmness in our mind and body, um, hopefully we use that to know the truths. And these
Yeah.
truths are complex and it's a messy process.
I really love that you talked about not trying to center exceptional history because I think there's a huge danger to that. Because today, I think we can agree, based on what's happening culturally, we're both in the United States, but also worldwide. We need people on the ground more than ever. And I
Mhm.
think in people's brains, they feel like we have to be exceptional or you're not doing enough.
Yes.
And it's so
Yes.
important to talk about that. Like, I want to talk more about like the little things that we can do. Like, you don't have to be exceptional to be part of a resistance movement.
Not at all. There are very few exceptional leaders. Very few. You can count
Yes.
on your fingers who you remember from each period in in not only yoga but in the larger historical frame, right?
Yeah.
Very few people are actually exceptional that you'll remember, like without reading. Like you
Yeah.
remember a few people, but who are the people who are and those are important names to remember and revere and all of that. But who are the people who are shifting narratives and culture, is like the everyday person who chooses to do something, who
Yes.
chooses to challenge something, who chooses to push back against boundaries and really say no to something, right?
Yeah.
There are so many ways to resist. It's no, and it's our every who chooses to buy something or chooses not to buy something,
Yeah.
so there are so many ways to resist. And honestly, we all have to do our own in our own ways, in our own authentic sustainable ways, because
Yeah.
activist quote unquote burnout is a real thing. Activist fatigue is a real thing. I feel so
Yes.
tired, like just opening Instagram or um Facebook. I feel really tired. I'm like, "Oh, this is too vast. Like I can't, like what is happening in the world and what can I even do? I'm just a person, one person." But and that is also true. So in those moments we just probably just hold ourselves with compassion and lean into community and all the practices of care and rest,
Yes.
but also then get up and then move forward again. And
Yeah, I think that it's important to highlight for people who might be listening, going, how can I get involved? I hate what's happening you could name a whole list of things that we all hate that's happening. Like, we
yeah,
don't have enough time to list all this stuff.
yeah,
But I think people need to know change happens in like the Monday mornings. I know everybody was at the march on Saturday. Everybody's going to march again this coming Saturday. We're right before the 14th of June, right? So no King's Day is going to come. We're all marching on Saturday, but change happens Monday morning when that person is applying for the permits for the next march and they're applying for the grants so they can pay the people to do the things. And they figured out how to get chairs so that they can sit while they're at their desks. Like, those are all things that are like useful and helpful and valid and part of what it means to shift and change a big culture. Like, you're not
hmm
doing too little. And your book gets to highlight like some of this too throughout history, which I think is really incredible.
Because some of the things that I highlight are things like debates,
Yeah.
things like radical love, things like reclaiming body agency,
Yeah.
um, and women who did that through history and through mythologic, through myth, through
Yeah.
embedded within the Puranas, for example.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I don't think there's anything which is a small thing that if it comes in the way of power.
Yeah.
Every pebble counts, every ripple counts, and marches are fantastic. Marches are important shows of maybe solidarity or protest. 100% they are important, but that's not the only thing. And it's also not
Yep.
accessible for many.
Correct.
It's not accessible for many. For people who are immigrants, for example, right now, it's dangerous to march,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
People who are trans, dangerous to march.
Yeah.
People who are who have wheelchair or mobility issues. Maybe it's not accessible for people to march, right?
Yeah.
So the marches are important, but it's not the only way to protest or resist.
Yeah, so I'm a solo mom, and I know lots of solo moms who have said to me, "Oh my God, I
Right.
really want to do that." But also the acknowledgement that if something happens to you, who's caring for your kids?
Yeah.
Like, and I always have to, hey, this is not the only thing we can do. This is
No.
not the only way we show up. In fact, there's a lot of like mundane behind the scenes things that are just equally as important. Like, I
Correct.
love the endorphin rush of getting out in the march with all the
Yeah.
other people. Like
Yeah.
like, like we're all in our favorite dopamine, serotonin, like
Yeah.
cocktail situation there. But
Yeah.
there's so many other things that we can be doing. And there's been a history of women standing up and doing things to resist that isn't necessarily just going to the march or doing the things that maybe, like you said, it's not accessible to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's one of the reasons why I also had to kind of chose that title, because embodiment is important in
Yeah.
resistance movements, and I think we have to be practicing how to be in our own bodies.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are many practices of yoga, from asana to pranayama to dhyana to all of the things are about really getting into the body and through the body to into the mind. And so
Yeah.
these are very important somatic uh, practices that we can lean into. And the more the world is getting us into these fragmented ways,
Yes.
we have to integrate, and we have to
Yeah.
learn how to be in our bodies, and that's the only way we can sustain resistance.
Talk to me about radical love. And I'm going to say this because I've just been every summer I reread like some sort of like liberation resistance person. And so I just dove into bell hooks this summer. And so talk to me about radical love because I've been reading about it all summer long.
I mean, bell hooks of I for in the context of yoga, radical love and bhakti, loving devotion,
Yes,
it
yes.
moved and continues to move uh, structures of power, right?
Yeah.
From caste and patriarchy to like class to everything. So that is a big part of the book for sure. And as a bhakti practitioner myself, I talk about it from a very personal way. And at the same time, it's also complicated because of caste and because of religious fundamentalism and
Yeah.
all of that is prevalent even now. So radical love is doing away with the middle person when it comes to liberation,
Yeah.
right? It's really opening up your hearts, and it's really opening up your hearts, minds, and being in the presence of the sacred,
Yeah.
and traversing, the traversing human experiences without any uh, what do you say, without any boundaries
Yeah.
put upon you or put upon the other, and really seeing the other person, really seeing the sacred and the divine in the other person also,
Yeah.
right? So I'm not very ritualistic. as you may have like uh, intuited. But because I grew up in in a home which my mother was very like sort of um had her pujas and her rituals, and she was very sort of that sort of oriented, and my dad was an atheist, so we always had these conversations of both happening at the
Yeah.
same time.
Yeah.
Lot of questioning, and I was always encouraged to question, and I always encourage my children to question everything as well.
Yeah.
So to practice discernment, inquiry, along with radical love, right? You cannot just go
Yeah.
around loving everybody, and with this, and then that can also create a lot of problems. So
Yeah.
one has to practice discernment also. So I talk about that also in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I've never met or read any like revolutionary who didn't to some degree come out with like what Dr. King said, nobody's free till everybody's free, which
Hmm.
is just essentially that act of radical love
Hmm.
on like a revolutionary scale. Like,
Hmm.
and I'm curious of yoga's history for that. And I'm also curious how that can be a bit of an antidote for that religious fundamentalism piece that we sometimes experience in the yoga space.
I don't know. I think because where we are in the moment right now, the what is required is how radical love can, or bhakti, and can fuel courage. we
Ooh,
need we,
yeah.
we need more of us to be courageous in our opposition. We need more of us to be courageous in our vocalization, and embracing differences,
Yeah.
and embracing a complicated history, right? So I think I think that's where I would see the role of radical love, really seeing the humanity and the humaneness in the other,
Yeah.
even though we probably are divided by religion, even though we're probably divided by all the differences that we are seeing right now, right?
Yeah.
Of country, of religion, of political differences, of all the things. I really think that's the challenge of humanity itself right now, to look at each other as human beings,
Yeah.
and not in this whole like kumbaya moment, but really look at each other
Yeah.
in a direct, unwavering uh, uh, dedication to uh, what do you say, transformation.
Yeah.
And transformation requires like the sort of the granularity, and the granularity comes from human interactions,
Yes.
right? It is a human interaction that creates the systems, right? So how can I in my human interactions really see you, who you are,
Yeah.
and come with that sort of intention to say, I'm going to just see you for who you are, and you're going to see who I am, and we are going to talk, and maybe we will have differences. In fact, we hopefully should have differences. Otherwise, you're talking in a very insulated bubble, which also is
Yeah.
happening a lot,
Yes.
right? So how
Yes.
can you really talk to another person, be with the differences, which is very, very challenging to do. That's why you need those somatic practices, and the
Yeah.
time to really integrate and cultivate those relationships across differences. So, for example, in the book, I have Tenmodi Soundararajan, who is a Dalit feminist who has written The Trauma of Caste, writing the foreword for the book. And in that, she talks about how yoga has been oppressive. So,
Yeah.
and that, as a caste privileged person, first of all, the trust that she placed in me to write a foreword itself is like a great honor. And uh, and I think one of the reasons why she wrote it is because, and why I think is a good sort of a fit, is because we both really want to shift culture. we
Yeah.
both we both really want to open doors. I hope this is only the first of many, where we are
Yeah.
having people from different positionalities um, come to a place of trust,
Hmm.
right? And I hope that really inspires many other people to question all the things.
Can we do a moment of a terminology breakdown for folks who maybe don't understand ideas of caste, Brahmin, Dalit? Can you define those terms for us just so my listeners have an idea, especially, white Westerners on the whole, we have no freaking clue. I know, but
Yeah, yeah. No, so I've written that. That's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, honestly, because I wanted to offer a sort of a introductory lens to the caste system, and it's a
yeah,
very the word caste system itself is a very oversimplified way of talking about it. But as an introduction, caste is like one of the oldest social stratification systems of the world,
yeah,
and came into being nearly 2,500 years ago, from a South Asian context, and it's d- started off as a division of labor as agriculture set in, and from Brahmins, who were scholars and priests, Kshatriyas, who were the rulers and the soldiers and the army and all of that, Vaishyas, who were the merchant and the landowners, business people, and then there were the Shudras, who were the artisans and the workers and the laborers. And then there was another category called the Dalit folks. That term came in much later, but it's a vast sort of a collection of folks who are outside what we call as the Varna system, which is uh, what we call now as the Varna Jati system, because then there was a um, development of what we call as Jati, which are endogamous units where people could not get married to people from different Varnas. So subcastes, you can say, in
yeah,
some ways. So the Varna Jati system is what we call as a caste system, and the Brahmin scholars and the Kshatriyas had a lot of power, both institutional power and in terms of around spiritual traditions, as well as economic and political power. So that's in a very simplified way, that is the sort of a basis.
yeah.
Yeah, and I talk about all of that in the book, about um, how these kind of intersect and are in dynamic tensions with each other.
I think it's important that we highlight some of that because I do think when you're online, sometimes you'll get in conversations where someone will say yogis were Brahmins. And I think a lot of people, when they're reading that, won't understand exactly what that even means. And so I appreciate you breaking that down for us, like, because there's also the idea of privilege. And you said I come from privilege, and privilege means a lot of things. Like in modern culture, privilege means money most often.
Ah,
But
no. No, no. So
there we go. Yeah, yeah,
caste and class are two different. Caste and class
yep,
are interrelated too. They are not that they are separate, because anyway, I don't want to go into that. But caste and class are separate, and also they're not the same.
yeah,
They're related, but they're not this. They're both. They're same and they're different. So, but it's
yeah,
not the same thing. It's not money only, because there are very poor Brahmins too. You know,
yes,
there are very rich Shudras, and that too now.
yeah,
So now in the present moment, and historically too, there are exceptional Shudra kings and all of that, which I talk
yeah,
about in the book too. But systemically, institutionally, who held the power in terms of, in the context of yoga, it's a
yeah,
very, because it's such a vast topic. I obviously cannot do all the things. I don't even have the expertise to talk about everything about history or even yoga history. So it's a very specific sort of a thing that I'm trying to talk about, which is
yeah,
feminist lens on caste and gender in yoga history, and even not all of it, but some of it.
yeah. How do you think that impacts us today? Like, as we're sitting here in the US and the West as yoga practitioners, like, because I worry sometimes that people feel like understanding this is like an extra. It's like the extra credit class, as
Mm,
opposed to really understanding our a history that we are a part of, right?
mm,
So
mm.
how do you feel like it impacts us today?
That's a good, very, very good question. And I really sought with this question, Rebecca, because somebody once asked me, why have I written this? Why did I choose to write this book? Like,
Yeah.
I could write about, say, just the beautiful practice of yoga. And from a South Asian woman, that would be a bestseller, I hope.
Yeah, right, right, right.
Or write even about cultural appropriation, because that is like the thing that everybody writes about, right? All
Yeah.
South Asians are writing about cultural appropriation.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that also is an important thing, but, or rather, and uh, I wanted to write about this, and why I think it's important is because these are invisible, untold things,
Yeah.
and it's very much like I think it was Tenmori who said that, caste is invisible. It's like the air you breathe.
Yeah.
And it's there, and it's unnamed. And that's why many people who are caste oppressed people, like Dalit folks, or even people who are not from the Hindu religion, and that is a whole another complicated thing. But they don't feel comfortable coming to a yoga class because they
Yes.
feel that it is it has been oppressive, it has an oppressive history of because of caste, or because of other religious aspects that come into a yoga class, or are a part of a yoga class that are against, say for example, Christianity or Islam, right?
Yeah.
So and those are all interrelated things in many ways because of the history which has been narrated by Europe, Europatriarchy, as well
Yeah.
as Brahmin men preserved. But typically, people who are from the American, European schools, studios, and yoga spaces have been shaped by Euro American scholarship, right?
Yeah.
So, and caste is not really mentioned, or it's mentioned as a footnote, right? And so my book is almost like a part, you can say, my own understanding of it as a caste privileged woman, my own understanding of it, my own study of it, not only caste but patriarchy in general, and how it has shaped some of the teachings of yoga, and how teachings of yoga has shaped society. Because what we think of as quote unquote the teachings and the texts of yoga are actually broader, right?
Yeah.
Like for example, the Gita is not really a yoga text, though it is now considered as a yoga text.
Yeah.
It's one of the most important texts which has shaped the cultural, social, political ethos of multitudes of people for centuries. I did not
Yes.
even think of it as a yoga text until I came to this country, and then everybody was like, Bhagavad Gita is one of the yoga texts. I'm like, but I wasn't a practitioner then, but for me, Bhagavad Gita was still considered to be a very important text.
Yeah.
So are the Upanishads. So are so many texts. So for me, really to look at these issues, and from the lens of a yoga practitioner as well as a feminist,
Yeah.
that is I found that lens missing. And as a practitioner myself, I would have loved to study this also, in a teacher training, or even just as a practitioner, right? Or
Yeah.
a person who's interested in history, or a feminist history. Because I think as women right now, we are really looking at the world from a lens of what has been told to us by men for
Yes.
centuries.
Yes.
Right? So really, we need to. I mean, I know there are wonderful, brilliant art activists and artists and scholars who are doing this work of pushing back and vocalizing and verbalizing these narratives and challenging these narratives, and we need more of that in the yoga world.
Yes. Yes, we
So
do.
we do. So that I hope that it really fulfills that niche. And like I said, it's an experiment. I don't know whether it will land and whether people will
Yeah.
like it. I really have no idea, but that has been the intention.
Okay. So tell us all things about how, because we're all going to go buy your book now. How do we buy it? Where, how do we find you? Tell us all those things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's available right now for pre-order.
Okay.
You can order it from Amazon. I hope you buy it from independent bookstores,
um,
uh,
bookshop.org.
bookshop.org. You can look at my website and get many links there, yoganjali.me. So there are basically, you can Google it and it'll be there. Yoga as Embodied Resistance, um, by Anjali Rao. So it's right there.
Okay. Leave us with a final thing. If I'm ordering the book because I just heard this interview and now, like me, you're a fangirl and you're going to go order the book, tell me what you want us to think about when we're going to read this book. Give us a final nugget.
Ooh. Okay, so I just want to let the listeners know that I have not practiced these questions. I just
Tell me your deepest, darkest secrets.
um, what would I love for you to leave with is a deep sense of pride.
Ooh, yes.
Pride at our history, our shared yoga history of ancestors who challenged structures of power, which at times where there was a lot of despair, which we are facing right now, as well as the capacity to build, or rather, capacity to hold complexity and challenge oversimplified narratives, and be in this transformative moment, because I think we are really going through some real struggles all over the world right now. Um, so, so that would be my hope, that you look at it as a stepping stone, if for many, hopefully, and for others, it may be like, I knew all of this, right? But for some, it may be completely new information. So
Yeah.
either way, I would hope that it sparks conversations. I wanted to ignite people to have conversations with each other, to challenge all our histories now. Now, look at histories and say, I want people to say, look at books and say, who wrote this book? And why was this book written?
Yeah.
And I'm not only talking about the present moment, but I'm saying go back 500 years and say who wrote the books and why were the books written and what are they saying in those books and how has that shaped the
Yeah.
world right now?
Oh, it doesn't matter you didn't practice. That was a hell of a good answer. Okay, tell everybody how to find you online.
Well, hopefully on, I mean, not hopefully. I think Instagram is probably the better way to find me.
Okay.
Yoganjali.me, though I'm trying to be yoganjali.com, but whatever, Yoganjali at Instagram. And yoganjali.me on my website. Um, that's about it. And I'm actually going to be holding a reading circle for the book, like author led one, because I feel like I hope that people are going to read this and say, I really want to discuss this with the author and or with each other and spark these discussions. So I'm going to hold those, and all that information is there on my website as well. Um, so yeah, those are the big things, and I'm trying to really pace myself as well. I'm going to India. My parents live there, so I'm going to take some time off, and um, that's probably the ways in which you can find me and connect with me.
Oh, that's great. Oh, I'm really excited you're doing discussion groups. Like, if I can
Yeah,
find time, I'm 100% gonna be there.
I hope so. I hope so. I really feel like more. I'm looking at teachers
Yeah,
to get the book, and I hope I was telling our friend Jeevana,
yeah,
I want this book to land in a yoga teacher training more than anything else, because I feel like
nice.
that really shapes the yoga spaces and sparks conversation. So for me, my hope and my aspiration is that it lands as a recommended reading on a yoga teacher training.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm obsessed with you, and so I'm sure you'll be
Oh,
on again. Thank
thank
you
you,
so
thank you,
much.
thank you so much, Rebecca, for having me, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Anjali. Here are our key takeaways. First, who writes history matters. Well, this is something that you might have heard. I think it takes a long time to really absorb how narratives of history are typically written by one group, white men. Remember that line from Hamilton that George Washington says, "You have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story"? Now imagine that nobody ever considered telling the stories of women in the history of yoga. We might come to the conclusion that there's no history of women at all. Now, Anjali proves that theory wrong, and it's worth asking yourself about that every time you encounter a new historical narrative, because history matters. And for me, I think it's a joy to see it being added to and given more context as we go forward in time. Next, ooh, I like this idea of talking about how a lot of writers of our yoga history are scholars first and not practitioners first. This relationship makes a difference. The overwhelming majority of us in the yoga professional space, I think, would consider ourselves practitioners first. I hope so, anyway. And that gives us a dedication to the practice and a desire to honor the tradition of yoga. When you're reading histories of yoga, just please ask yourself if the author is a practitioner first or a scholar writer first. At the very least, that means you know the point of view that they're coming from. Next, I talked about the exceptionalism in historical narratives angle in the intro, but it's worth re-mentioning here. It's important that we write about everyday folks who live lives as well as the people who we perceive to be exceptional. The truth is, most of us are exceptional from time to time. But when we only talk about those truly always exceptional people, people who've given up everything else to dedicate their lives to something, it makes us feel like we can't join the charge to enact change in our communities. And that simply isn't true. Next, I know I've mentioned it before, but I want to remind you again, change happens in the quiet moments. The permits on Mondays after the marches, the prep for the speeches, the helping of a neighbor when they need it. There's so many ways we can support resistance and change, so please consider how you can join the fight for our futures, even if it's just making sure your local candidate's office has folding chairs to sit on, because honestly, I think you'd be surprised how many times that issue comes up. And finally, as Anjali said, every pebble counts. Anjali and I talk quite a bit about social change and radical love, two of my favorite topics, if I'm honest. And I want to remind you, dear listeners, that every small thing you do adds up to a better, more just, and more beautiful world. I know sometimes it doesn't feel that way, especially in the current time where we live, where it feels like oppression and awfulness are around every corner. But what the loud oppressors don't want you to know is that we can work in the shadows. We can do checks on teenagers who we think might be in a tough situation casually and without pretense. We can quietly fill the little free pantries in our neighborhoods. We can make sure our elders have had enough to eat today besides a peanut butter sandwich, and that their AC works in hot weather and your heat works in cold weather. We can move around the world in a way that inspires other people to quietly do the same. Women have been doing this work since the beginning of forever, and my hope is that I get the opportunity to spend my life joining them in their joyful and loving support of the world. Next week, I get the opportunity to talk with a fellow podcaster and yoga studio expert trainer, Michael J. We get into the what's happening now of the yoga studio space, and honestly, we have so many laughs while we do it. Until then, my friends, let's go get to work, and I'll catch you around the water cooler next time.